Welcome to Writer's Review, where today we're taking a look at Terms of Enlistment by Marko Kloss. As usual, we'll start off the review with the main spoiler-free section, and then I'll give you a glimpse into the content of the first few chapters of the book, and at the very end I'll cover some lessons that the writers among you can take away from the author, and I'll have the timestamps for these individual sections on screen now. So let's jump right into the review. Terms of Enlistment is the first book in the Frontlines series, and 5 of its sequels have already been released by this point. The overarching story hasn't concluded yet, so there are probably a couple more sequels left to go. All in all, the series falls into the science fiction category and has a very strong emphasis on military life. The story is told mostly from the first person's perspective in the present tense, and a very realistic exposition style, which makes it really easy to get into the main character's shoes as we follow along his journey. From the start of the novel, it's assumed that you, the reader, have a basic understanding of military ranks and military jargon, so if that's not the case, you might want to brush up on those on the wiki, but if you decide to jump into the novel nonetheless, this isn't really something that will break your enjoyment of the story itself. As for the plot, it centers around the only point of view character who grew up in one of the many slum cities of the future USA. His only hope to escape the slums is to enlist in the military, which is exactly what he does in the first few opening chapters. The rest of the novel is then dedicated to his training and early military career, and along the way he meets a variety of personalities and experiences the whole spectrum of military life, from the wholesome banter between squadmates to the more terrifying aspects of war. And although a lot happens throughout this novel, I'd say that about 90% of the events form only the prologue to the main plot of the series. The main subgenres you can expect are obviously action, drama, and surprisingly romance. The action is perhaps the strongest element of this novel. The combination of first person's perspective and present tense somehow make everything much more lifelike and urgent. The author's real-life military experience also shows in his tendency to pick out little details which make everything feel much more realistic. He also doesn't shy away from describing the violence itself, but I wouldn't say that he ventures into the realm of excessive violence or gore. A lot of the drama is based on the smaller disagreements between individuals that you'd expect from any novel, and there's also a lot of conflicts between and within the military branches presented throughout the novel. Romance, on the other hand, pops up in shorter bursts throughout the story, and somehow manages to be the main subplot that ties the entire series together. Most importantly, it isn't forced and is depicted in a very mature light, without the typical tropes like love triangles and the needless drama. Alongside these main elements, you can also expect to find quite a bit of comedy spicing up the storytelling, along with world building as the main character travels around to different places. There are also a few philosophical elements, mostly to do with the rifts between the individual social classes presented in the book, and towards the end of the novel, you can expect to find a rather lengthy, suspense-oriented sequence. As far as other notable characteristics of the book, I'd say that it has a very unique take on the depiction of military life. At some sections, it can be so lifelike that it feels like you're actually listening to someone recount a real story of their military life. The novel also has a couple instances of excessive use of force, so those of you who enjoy reading about big explosions, you have something to look forward to in this novel. I will say that the series has gotten quite long over the years, so if you do plan on jumping in and binging the whole thing, you might find the experience a bit tiresome, but if you enjoy long space operas like this, you definitely won't regret picking up this novel. In conclusion, Terms of Enlistment is available in ebook, paperback, and audio formats, the latter of which is performed by Luke Daniels. I personally really enjoyed this book, and I think you will too, especially if you're a sci-fi buff or enjoy things of a military nature. But just in case, here are some ratings of what other people thought of this novel. As usual, the ebook version is the cheapest by far, but surprisingly, the audiobook and paperback versions are going for the same rate. If you're interested in getting the audiobook version, Don't buy it directly on Amazon or use an Audible credit, but rather make use of the WhisperSync deal, because you'll be getting both the ebook and audiobook version for far cheaper than the audiobook version by itself. That about wraps up the spoiler-free section of the review, and now I'll be going into a sort of elevator pitch for the story of the novel. So we follow Andrew Grayson from the Boston Metroplex, a sort of future slum, as he joins the military in the hope of reaching a better life and the chance to journey into space. He endures the rigors of boot camp and is molded into a soldier. There he also makes a few new friends and meets Hallie, who is his main love interest throughout the rest of the series. At the end of boot camp, the privates of his training battalion receive their deployment orders to go into space with the Marines and Navy, but Grayson is the only one to remain on Earth with the Territorial Army. Eventually, he does get a chance to go into space, but to find out how, you're just gonna have to go out and read the novel for yourself. For the writers among you, here's what I think you can take away from this novel. The first takeaway, I think, is that if you plan on having a romantic subplot in your novel, it doesn't have to be the stereotypical rom-com affair that you're used to. For instance, in this novel, you'll see that the interactions between Andrew and Hallie are mostly mundane, such as texting about how their training is going, where they're gonna meet next, and so on. And I think that the often simple and mundane interactions between the two is what makes their relationship so relatable for the reader. Second is how the author handled the first person's perspective description of the action. I've already described how this affects the tension of these set pieces, but now I'd like to go into how he handled all the other aspects. For instance, you might think that by doing so, he would be restricted to only describing the infantry sections. Instead, the author seamlessly integrates air combat and space combat descriptions by making use of displays or data terminals that Andrew has access to. Towards the end of the novel, I really think you should pay attention to how the author handled the introduction of the Lankies, because he delayed their physical description as late as possible. First, he gave the reader a feeling of what they're capable of by having the ship be destroyed, then introducing the spire and the gassed city, and next hinting at their size through the rumbling of the ground, and giving the actual physical description moments before the first shot was actually fired. And lastly, I think this book is an excellent example of what a good outline can produce, although I am speculating here a bit. If you look even at the subtle use of foreshadowing throughout this book, for instance, the use of the thermobaric grenade against the sniper early on in the book, which ties into the destruction of the high-rise in the riot section, or the introduction of Fallon's demotion rumors, which then tie into the confrontation with Major Unworth in the hospital section of the book. And there are so many other little things throughout the books which set up future events and characters in a similar way. That brings us to the end of this review. I hope you enjoyed watching the video and found it at least a bit informative. Leave a comment down below and I'll see you on the next review.